Hello, hi, welcome. My name is Lord Hardthresher, First Earl of Buggeroff, amateur gynecologist and sometime historian, and you have, by accident or by design, landed on my channel, so, hello. I say by accident or by design, but there's been a 99.6% chance that you came here because of a certain wonderful pig creature thing who was gracious enough to big up my offerings recently. On the off chance you don't know who he is, because this video is being recorded now, today, as I talk, clearly, it will show up on the internet and there's a timey-wimey thing. Well, look, whatever. If you haven't come across Lazerpig, find his channel, find it now, stop my video, find his channel, subscribe. I'll see you in a few hours. For the rest of you who've been good enough to come here and spend some time, today I'm going to embark upon an idea that I've had in the works for a while, and I'm going to talk about the Battle of Britain. Wait. Promise to keep the rising crescendos of Elgar... Shut up, Jenkins, for the love of God! Put that cello down! We will keep the Elgar to a minimum, and I will also try to avoid the flappy hurricane gun port shot, which a lot of you may be familiar with. We are going full-bore nerd here. We're going to look at stuff that you just won't find on the History Channel, and if it's not your bag, no problem at all. Just stop the video here. No hard feelings at all. No hard feelings. Stop. Right. The normie's gone. Ready to nerd. Excellent. Let us begin. It is traditional to come across from time to time on certain corners of the internet, or even actually in very well-funded and well-read publications, the troll known as the Wehraboo. This small nocturnal creature grew up in the shadow of historians who wrote in the 60s and 70s, and who said, broadly speaking, that the Nazi war machine was the greatest thing that's ever existed on Earth. Often the Wehraboo at larval stage was exposed to crappy History Channel documentaries which endlessly recycled Nazi propaganda because, talking heads are expensive. As they grew to maturity and developed the full plethora of lifestyle-related health issues that is natural for their species, their fur thickened and they began to worship at the altar of the Nazi supermenschens. Yes, that's a word. I'm British. I said it's a word, so it's a word. According to them, for example, the Tiger tank was amazing. I'll have to take their word for it. I've no idea about tanks. The MG42 was the greatest gun of the war. The ME262 was the greatest wonder weapon of the war. Germany would have won easily if it hadn't been for that pesky Hitler kid getting in the way of the good, sensible decision-makers like Heinz Guderian or Erwin Rommel, and if these individuals are deeply afflicted, Ribbentrop and Keitel. Occasionally the Wehraboo will have got beyond Wikipedia and picked up on one of the many biographies of war written by the former Nazi soldiers and airmen. I Flew for Hitler, Panzer, Lanzer, and there are many others besides. What the Wehraboo often forgets is that absolutely everything published by anybody in a position of command, or really any part of the Nazi war machine after it was all over, is reading an exercise in self-justification. It's a thing which is designed to perform what was known at the time as a Percy White treatment. That is, it was going to deflect any guilt that might exist for the Holocaust and justify a position. And more often than not, these documents are not so much books as long-form applications for positions of command with NATO. They are, in other words, complete bullshit of the highest order. It is quite possible to read these diaries and accounts published post-war and learn something from them, but that something is almost always implied and not printed on the paper. It's what's not said that's key, and often the bit that doesn't make it into the English language is actually more informative than the bits that do. Now, the lesser-spotted male Wehraboo is a timid creature by his very nature. He will, of course, puff himself up and make himself look all fierce on a regular basis, but if you are a courageous historian who disagrees with a Wehraboo, there's really nothing you can do except to grip him firmly by the cods and give him what for. Thusly, the Luftwaffe was nothing like as good as the black and white propaganda films make out. It exaggerated its numbers. It failed in every theatre it fought in after October 1940. Seems not so hard, and now the Wehraboo will spend the next 3 or 4 hours composing a wall of text that we can safely block and ignore. Now we can get on with the task at hand. I pick October 1940 quite specifically because it was then that the Luftwaffe bravely ran away and admitted defeat in the Battle of Britain. This had huge implications for the war. That defeat meant that the Nazis couldn't invade Britain, if they ever really had meant to in the first place. It meant that Britain could be sure of drawing on US manufacturing capabilities and the Lend-Lease program in the long term. And that guaranteed that eventually, irrespective of the US's entry into the war, irrespective of any attack on the Soviet Union, the Germans would run out of raw materials before the Dominion, United Kingdom and Empire forces did. And crucially, it meant that Hitler felt he had no choice but to attack Russia far earlier than he had planned to. The Luftwaffe's defeat was not a tactical one, it was a strategic and absolute defeat, and it effectively sealed the Nazi state's fate. Of course, there are those of you who, like me, grew up with stories of the plucky few, the British fighter races who, despite their amateurism and small numbers, defeated the might of the Luftwaffe with pluck and a stiff upper lip. Now, turn that fucking Elgar off! Thank you! We were taught that in the summer of 1940, after the defeat of France, Britain stood entirely alone against Hitler's hordes, who heard Winston Churchill— I swear if you touch that cello! Who heard Winston Churchill's words in countless documentaries, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. And they took it quite literally. Whereas the truth is very different. British fighter pilots were highly professional and the Luftwaffes weren't. Britain was far from alone. It had its empire and its dominions to call on. This gave Britain access to almost unlimited raw materials which Germany didn't have. Britain could call on the empire for large numbers of highly educated young men capable of flying and fighting and developing the technical tools of war. Germany didn't have those things. And crucially, Britain had access to vast, safe, open spaces for pilots to learn to fly, and safe harbour if things went tits up in Britain, and Germany didn't. For those who perhaps haven't been made familiar with the story over the years, arguably the Battle of Britain really began in September 1939 with the start of World War II. This was the point when Britain and France declared war on Germany. Note, if you will, the "and France" bit of that statement. France and Britain had fought together in the Crimea and then in World War I, and we had literally died and bled in the trenches together. Nearly 1 million Dominion, United Kingdom and Empire troops were buried in battlefields in France from the 1914-18 war. We'd fought to protect French land. We took it very seriously. 10% of France's entire population had been killed or wounded in that war, and the feats of French arms on the Marne, in Champagne, at Verdun, at the Somme, at Cambrai, at Arras, and dozens of other bloody, terrifying World War I battlefields were whispered with awe and reverence by British veterans of World War I. France, at the beginning of 1939, had 900,000 enlisted men, and it could call on 5 million more. It had thousands of aircraft, hundreds of tanks, kilometres of concrete emplacements between it and Germany. Britain's strategy for the whole of the 20s and 30s was to rely on the French on land, whilst we did the sensible thing and bobbed around on the sea in massive fucking battleships. It was then something of an upsetting shock to discover that the French couldn't actually fight in 1939. It turns out that when you have a government who changes more regularly than a whore's knickers, and you have a set of commanders in their late 60s and 70s who have no radio communication with their troops, who'd learnt the lessons of 1916 very well, but completely ignored the lessons of 1918, and whose aircraft hadn't been updated.
Hi, this is Lord Hardthrasher here. Look, my sincere apologies. I just said there that the French aircraft hadn't been upgraded. That is actually completely not true. There were 1,000 almost brand new fighters on the stands in a number of air bases all across France at the beginning of 1940. Specifically, the most numerable was the MS-406, which was a genuinely good aircraft. Unfortunately, the French Air Force hadn't updated any of the systems to control it, and they didn't put any radios in them, which meant that they couldn't fight them. Yes, anyway, it's not true. Yeah, apologies. Anyway, as you were, carry on.
And whose propensity to panic when faced with unforeseen eventualities was on a par with a Daily Mail reader faced with a migrant in a boat, well then, you're pretty fucked. After just 3 weeks of fighting, France was knocked out of the war. By the grace of an inexplicable order by Hitler to halt his panzers for 2 days, the Royal Navy's numbers and guts, some stubborn last-ditch French resistance, and not a little luck, Britain's army was miraculously evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk by the 4th of June 1940 during Operation Dynamo. Some 338,000 men were brought back to England, including 112,000 French. Sadly, of those, 3,000 remained in the UK. The rest asked to be repatriated to carry on the fight, which they were allowed to do over the following week, only for France to surrender about 10 days later. Although Operation Dynamo had saved the men, the army was basically as fucked as a Welsh sheep in every other regard. It had no tanks, no trucks, no artillery, no machine guns, no ammunition, just a lot of soggy men in uniform. The German army, the one which had taken Poland in 26 days, which had taken Holland in 5, which had invaded Denmark almost by accident over 24 hours, had taken Norway in 2 months, and now had destroyed 20 years of strategic assumptions in 3 weeks, that army was camped 26 miles away across the English Channel. To say that there was some concern in London would be fair. As defeat unfolded in France, Churchill had become PM, and following one of the nastiest political fights in history, by June he had his cabinet, his party, and his people under control. There would be no surrender in 1940. Churchill is one of those characters about whom so much has been written and who elicits deep emotion, primarily because of this period in 1940, when he really was the last European leader standing who opposed Nazism. I'm not going to attempt to analyse his actions in detail. That's another video for another day. There are, however, some things that we need to bear in mind about how he saw the world, and indeed about how Britain saw the world, which go a long way to explaining the way that he behaved and why he was so well supported. Number one, he saw the empire as an unequivocal good. He saw it as a structure that educated and lifted the masses up, that it ruled over, and it would eventually allow them to attain a state of liberal democracy at some unnamed point in the future. Okay, so now I've said that bit out loud with my eyes shut, I can almost feel the rage pouring off certain people in the comment section. I remind them, and I remind you before you report me to the thought police, this is what Churchill believed. And he spent a good deal of his career actually killing Nazis and telling Stalin to do one, so I will basically forgive him anything for that. Whatever, his thoughts are a matter of record. He was from a time and an age that was taught to think like that, and on his many periods of service abroad in South Africa and Sudan, in India, he filtered out basically everything which might be contrary to that view and came to believe that the empire really did embody those beliefs. So in 1940, it meant he had no doubts about the righteousness of his cause, unlike, say, Lord Halifax or, come to that, actually Lloyd George. Number two, he believed even in June 1940 that the empire would survive the war and flourish afterwards. When he gave his famous and mocking speech saying, "If our empire lasts 1,000 years," he was taking the piss out of Hitler's constant references to the 1,000-year Reich, but he was also quite serious that he thought that the empire would continue well beyond his lifetime. However, he was absolutely convinced that Nazism must be opposed at all costs. And I mean literally at all costs. If it proved necessary, he would sacrifice the empire, the country, and himself to defeat it. By 1940, he'd been saying this in public, in private, and in his journalistic writings for 8 years. He thought he knew the nature of his foe absolutely, and he absolutely opposed them. Number three, he saw personal safety as an afterthought throughout his life, and he could never really understand why others might feel differently. It made him courageous, but it also made him totally blind to the opinions of others when he thought them being cowardly. There are many stories about his personal courage under fire, from his early army life through to the trenches of the Great War, to 1940 indeed, when he flew into France a number of times despite the risk from being intercepted by the Luftwaffe. Famously, he was captured during the Boer War when the train that he was on was ambushed. Without a thought for his own safety, and despite the fact he was actually technically a journalist and not holding his commission at the time, he assumed command. He coaxed the driver back into the cab, got the train moving, saw the men off on it, and only then realised that he also needed to be on the train, which meant that he was promptly captured. Number four, he felt his right to rule in his bones. He'd been convinced ever since he was a schoolboy that one day he would lead his country in a moment of extreme crisis. He therefore had no doubts about his own actions, and in May 1940 this was a superb asset, just as it had been, and indeed it would become again, a major flaw in his thinking at other times. I think he would have been a total nightmare to work for, and indeed the chief of the Imperial General Staff for most of the war, Sir Alan Brooke, regularly had stand-up rows with him and offered to resign on multiple occasions, and his diaries are filled with vitriol towards Churchill. But the reality was Churchill's drive and tenacity in May 1940, and indeed during much of the war, held the course. And so from about June, this was the dynamic leader who supported the RAF, who had the support of the country, and he was going to do exactly what was necessary when he deemed it necessary to win the fight. As I mentioned a minute ago, Britain had an empire, and it's a fact that you've probably grasped if you ever looked at the map that was printed before 1950. And because Britain had an empire and it had ruled significant proportions of the Earth's surface for really quite protracted periods of time, it can come as a bit of a shock to outsiders when they learn that there are basically only two things which will really piss the average Brit off: bullies and show-offs, and to a large extent this informed Churchill's views, but not just him, it informed a specific proportion of the population too. Brits to this day are, for example, endlessly bemused by the American penchant for what I'm reliably informed is called bling or drip. Whereas in goodly chunks of the United States, supergluing diamonds to your front teeth and wearing sunglasses that look like solar arrays is considered de rigueur, here it rains a lot, you just look like an idiot and you wouldn't be able to see much. It's why, for example, Oswald Mosley, leader of the British Union of Fascists, was considered a laughingstock when he tried to set the party up in 1933. Of course, losing the Battle of Cable Street in 1936 and being knocked out by a well-aimed Liverpudlian stone in 1937 didn't help his cause much either. I've always loved Liverpool, fantastic place. Churchill, coincidentally, had Oswald arrested under Section 18B just as soon as he took office. I digress, it's just funny to mention that. Given these national characteristics, when the tiny-willied, testicularly challenged corporal and his single-digit IQ mate somehow managed to claw their way to the top of the German state, there was quite a lot of eye-rolling and meaningful sighing in the UK. New broom looks a lot like the old broom, we thought. Corporal becomes the Kaiser. Except, of course, it wasn't. This was an order of magnitude worse. As the 1930s progressed and it became clear that Adolf and his chums were violent bullies, hell-bent not just on victimising Jewish people in their own country, but also subjugating the nation-states around them, Churchill's warnings began to hit home, and from about 1936 war became inevitable, as even Chamberlain belatedly realised, and Britain started to rearm. Back then to the story. Where were we? Oh yes, okay, so Dynamo had just wrapped up, and in London, Churchill was giving speeches that remain some of the most profound of all time. All along the French coast, the Luftwaffe was frankly setting up its forward air bases, and in southeast England, the RAF was tooling up and rebuilding its strength. Meanwhile, in Berlin, there was, at least initially, an assumption that the British would surrender now, as any rational government would in their places. Indeed, Denmark and Norway and France and Belgium had all done when faced with this kind of military crisis. With Churchill as PM, though, it was apparent even to the heart of thinking in Hitler's entourage that Britain wasn't going to throw the towel in without coercion. And this was a bit awkward. The truth was that German forces were a bit knackered. They needed time to regroup. The public thought the war was over. They had taken Paris, for God's sakes. The army wanted to demobilise units, and indeed it began to do so. So the usual Nazi infighting and cock-up-mongery got underway. Depending on how you look at it, there were 3 or maybe 4 separate streams to the planning for invading England. First, there was the OKH, the Oberkommando der Heer, technically in charge of all Nazi armed forces, who laid out the basic need to invade but didn't really specify the means. Then there was the OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. This is the German Army High Command, and they envisioned a kind of channel crossing on a broad front, much as one might cross, say, a big section of the Rhine. And then there was the Oberkommando der Marine, the OKM, who realised that they would be cut to pieces by the Royal Navy, and so they planned for a very narrow-fronted assault on as few beaches as possible and tried to push paratroopers forward. So it was all going really well in Germany. Oh, I nearly forgot, of course, that you had the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, who were being pointed at by the OKH, the OKW and the OKM to clear the skies. Nice and simple job, lads. Göring, being Göring, said he could do it in 2 to 3 weeks, but just in case, he set himself a drop-dead date of early September. So this meant that the main thrust of the attacks would need to happen between now, that is June 1940, and August. But probably those attacks would start in a fairly piecemeal fashion, as the Luftwaffe Staffels became operational at their new bases in France from around mid-June. Like a late summer storm, the fighting would grow in intensity through July and August, and the toll was genuinely horrific on both sides. Before it was over, Luftwaffe pilots were regularly holding briefings by the toilets so that they could be sick with fear without embarrassing themselves. More than 15% of RAF pilots during the course of the battle received psychiatric treatment in spells in hospital. This was a uniquely aerial battle, with flames, bullets, and sudden death for the young men involved. I don't want to downplay this. I want to examine the bits of the battle that you may not have heard of in more detail, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that this was one of the most titanic aerial struggles which has ever happened in human history. And I want to try and do it with as few cliches and as little fucking Elgar as I can get away with. And of course, as few Hurricane gun ports as I can get away with as well. So with all of that said, time is somewhat against me this week and next, and June is shaping up to be a bit of a horror show for me as well. So I'm going to have to do this as and when I get 5 minutes. There is a non-zero chance that I wind up breaking this up into itty-bitty chunks and then maybe uploading one huge enchilada maya video in about a month's time, or I might get bored in a hotel room and just decide to have at it. Who knows? I'm planning to cover some of the major players. I want to talk about how the Luftwaffe and the RAF were actually formed and thus how that informed how they fought. I want to talk about the Dowding system. I want to talk about how they got into fights. I want to talk about broad brush strategy. What I won't be doing is a blow-by-blow, day-by-day account of the battle because I'm not a masochist and frankly it would take far too long, and if I spend too long on this, Her Ladyship will divorce me. So, next time in part 2, when we come back, I'm going to talk about why Lee Mallory was a complete bellend, how Goering, Udet, Milch and Kesselring were the least functional Third Reich leaders, and that is saying something given that it's a field which is packed to the rafters with arseholes, and why you should never make a man whose middle name is Beppo your intelligence officer. Oh, and also why gliding clubs are quite dangerous. Have a lovely evening, weekend, night, day, morning, whatever period of time it is with you. I will see you again very soon.